Is Congress going to pass a COVID-19 unvaccinated tax that you and your family will have to pay every year that you and your children are not vaccinated? Let's get into this and take a look. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to The Edge. This is Dusty Friday at the mic. Before we get into talking about an unvaccinated tax, one of the things that has led up to this and what will probably ultimately bring this about is a vaccine passport. It's been talked about in Europe. It's been talked about here in the United States. There have been massive demonstrations in Denmark and other parts of Europe protesting this. We've had some demonstrations here in America saying we don't want a travel passport or a vaccine passport. But there is one country that actually did end up passing a vaccine passport, and that is Israel. And so let's take a look at what Israel's done. This is from the Jerusalem Post. Demonstrators gather in Tel Aviv on Wednesday to protest against forced vaccination and the Green Passport program, which allows vaccinated individuals and recovered COVID-19 patients to take part in certain activities, including attending mass gatherings. Wow. Hey, wouldn't that be great to start attending things? But in order to do that, gotta be vaccinated and you have to have the passport. This also from the Jerusalem Post. Speakers and protesters alike called for more government transparency and to stop tyranny. The protesters demanded that the government cancel the Green Passport initiative, which they say leads to a two-tier system within Israel's society, a privileged vaccinated class and a lower class of those who can't get the vaccine or don't want to. One large sign held by members of the crowd read "Apartheid" in English and Hebrew, both in bold next to a green passport. Another large sign equated green passports with the tattooed arms of former Auschwitz prisoners. So yeah, this is a problem that they have, and it will create an apartheid, no matter what country implements it. If you haven't been vaccinated, well, you just can't come here. You can't come into this grocery store or this bank or wherever you need to go, or this gym or this church. Wow, that would be a big mess. Also from the Jerusalem Post, gyms, theaters, hotels, concerts, and synagogues registered under the Green Passport program will be able to operate. Hooray, we can get back to operation, as long as you got the passport. A green passport will be required to enter certain places and to participate in certain activities. Only people who have been vaccinated or have recovered from coronavirus will be eligible for one. Remember, this is not a, hey, would this be a good idea or a bad idea? This is happening in Israel now. When you arrive at a store or other places of business, you will be asked to present your green passport. The printout can be presented for scanning, or the app can be opened on the digital information confirmation presented. You will be asked to present your ID card too. Business owners can scan the QR code on your certificate via the application, but not using other standard scanning apps. Are you kidding me? You get to go, if you want to go to the grocery store, you hold up your cell phone. Here's my certificate. They scan it. Okay, you can come in. This is 1984 at its worst. This is beyond 1984.
Keep away from me, Smith. I'm an agent of Goldstein. I didn't know it myself. Thought crime is so insidious. It just creeps up on you.
There's nothing I won't confess. Nothing. I've told you everything already. I mean, what is it you want me to know? Take him instead of me. He's the thought criminal. It's him you want.
Though 1984 could only dream or nightmare of what we're about to look forward. Israel, are you kidding me? Do you know what it says in your Talmud in the Old Testament? It says, you were strangers in Egypt. So when a stranger comes among you, you take them in. That is what the Lord said in the law of Moses. Take in the strangers, for you were strangers in Egypt. And now you're telling me you're passing something like this? And the real problem is, the United States, we have a high degree of respect for Israel, as we should. I'm in support of that. I support and love Israel. But the problem is if they pass this, or now that they've passed this, it is a precedent that will begin pushing into Western society. And I don't want that. I do not want a travel card or a passport, vaccine passport to get around. That is the definition of an apartheid. So is this coming to the USA? Well, it might. But here's the bigger problem. This is what I'm more worried about. I'm not so worried about this, although I am very worried about it, as I am about an unvaccinated tax. And people go, the government could never tax you for being unvaccinated. Really? You want to bet? The 2012 ruling on Obamacare, or what is called the Affordable Care Act, makes that unmistakably clear that Congress can tax for inactivity on a subject. For lack of activity, they can tax you. And that was done by John Roberts and the liberal side of the court in 2012 on the Obamacare ruling. And we're going to get into that right now.
What have you been doing, Robert?
So here we go. The National Federation of Independent Businesses versus Sebelius. The Supreme Court ruling for 2012, often called the Obamacare ruling. This is what the Supreme Court upheld for the individual mandate. That was the big part. Remember, there was that individual mandate that said you have to buy this. By the way, Congress never got rid of this law. It's still there. President Trump said, we're not going to bother with dealing with that individual mandate, and told IRS, you accept tax returns that don't have that filled out. Biden has done away with that, or is about to do away with that, and back to mandating the individual mandate. So let's take a look at what it says here. So it was called the Affordable Care Act, or the slang term was the Obamacare. Let's go through it. Before we go through it, I want you to know this. The Democrats in Congress, whether it's publicly or privately, are talking about doing this right now, using the precedent by the Supreme Court in the Affordable Care Act to put an unvaccinated tax on individuals and families. This is what they're trying to come out. And this ruling allows for that. And you go, no, it doesn't. They can't tax us if we're not vaccinated. By the Supreme Court, yes, they can. And if you stick around to the end of this show, I will tell you what we can do about it and how we can stop this. So let's first go through Wikipedia's page, and we'll take a look at what parts of this agreed with, how it got ruled in, how the ruling got passed. So remember, the Supreme Court has 9 justices. You need 5 in order to get a ruling upheld. It's a simple majority, and as long as the simple majority goes with it, that's it. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the opinion, or the court ruling, for this Obamacare. And here's ultimately what happened. Breyer, Sotomayor, Ginsburg, and Kagan ruled together on the liberal side, and they were joined by John Roberts, Chief Justice John Roberts. And that gave the majority 5 to uphold the individual mandate. Now, there were a few things that came out of this. The individual mandate was not upheld as part of the Commerce Clause or the Well-Being Clause. That there was a majority that ruled against it, so those were out because Congress came to them and said, we can tax people for not buying health care because of the Commerce Clause and because of the General Well-Being Clause. And the Supreme Court held, nope, that was not the case. But let's get into what they held on the individual mandate as a tax. Now, in order to understand this, and I'm going to break it down real simple. We will go through it for about 30 minutes, but it will be very easy to understand. So there is a law that came from like 1867 called the Anti-Injunction Act, which basically said that if you are challenging a tax, you have to first pay the tax and then go to court, and then you can get a refund. And the reason is Congress was being starved of its money. The Treasury was being starved of its money. So they passed the Anti-Injunction Act. So if you have a problem with a tax, you first pay it, then you have to get reimbursed if you win your court case. But here's the challenge. In this Obamacare ruling, the Chief Justice and even the liberal justices all agreed that the Anti-Injunction Act did not apply because this was not a tax. But then they went on to say, this was a tax and that's why it was legal. So let's get into what they did. So in the Chief Justice John Roberts' opinion on the ruling, so what the court held, he had several areas, several sections. Section 1 and Section 2 were not upheld. Section 3 of the opinion is upheld, and that's where the individual mandate became constitutional by the Supreme Court ruling. So let's go through Section 3. It is a long section, so we're going to go a couple of paragraphs. I'll skip a few paragraphs that aren't important, but I will read a paragraph and then we'll go through parts of it at a time as we go through looking at this. So here's the heading, the top paragraph to Section 3. Section 3 says, the government advances two theories for the proposition that Congress has constitutional authority to enact the individual mandate. First, the government argues that Congress has the power to enact the mandate under the Commerce Clause. Under that theory, Congress may order individuals to buy health insurance because the failure to do so affects interstate commerce. That came out of a ruling from an old ruling, 1895, late 1800s, ultimately got ruled on in 1942. A farmer was growing wheat for his own use, and Congress said, we can control you. And he said, no, you can't. The Supreme Court in 1942 upheld, yes, we can control you because you're not buying wheat on the open market affects the the interstate market. We can debate that. I think that was a terribly wrong ruling. And at the end of this program, we'll talk about how to fix that one too. But ultimately, Congress can tell you to do something under the Commerce Clause if you're not doing it affects interstate commerce. Now, remember, the Supreme Court held, no, that doesn't apply in this case. It was the first time the Supreme Court began to limit the Commerce Clause because the Commerce Clause has been taken way out of context. But either way, it says so. It affects and could undercut the Affordable Health Care's other reforms. Second, the government argues that if the commerce power does not support the mandate, we should nonetheless uphold it as an exercise of Congress's power to tax. According to the government, even if Congress lacks the power to direct individuals to buy insurance, the only effect of the individual mandate is to raise taxes on those who do not do so, and thus the law may be upheld as a tax. This is the part that was upheld, but they're saying even if we can't do it under the Commerce Clause, we can do it because we're allowed to tax as Congress goes. So Part A under Section 3 says the government's first argument is that the individual mandate is valid because of Congress's power under the Commerce Clause. We're not going to deal with that paragraph because the justices said, nope, you do not have the power to do that under the Commerce Clause. Point 2 was the government next contends that Congress has the power under the Necessary and Proper Clause. Nope. The Supreme Court held Congress does not have the power under the Necessary and Proper Clause, so we'll ignore that one. Section 3, Part C. This is what was upheld, and the next several paragraphs are what was upheld. So we're going to go through this. It's real heavy legalese, but stick with me because we're going to break it down piece by piece. So here it goes, Part C. The exaction of Affordable Care Act imposes on those without health insurance looks like a tax in many respects. This is a quote out of a Supreme Court ruling. Well, if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, then it's a duck. Which I kind of agree with that. But don't you think Congress ought to get their own terms right? The exaction the Affordable Care Act imposes on those without health insurance looks like a tax in many respects. The shared responsibility payment, as the statute entitles it, that's the individual mandate, is paid to the Treasury by taxpayers when they file their taxes. It does not apply to individuals who do not pay federal income tax because their household income tax is less than the threshold. For taxpayers who do owe the payment, the amount is determined by such familiar factors as taxable income, number of dependents, joint filing status. The requirement to pay is found in the Internal Revenue Code and enforced by the IRS. And the IRS is the one that must collect in the same manner of taxes. This process yields the essential feature of any tax. It produces at least some revenue for the government. Indeed, the payment is expected to raise. It goes on to talk about how much it'll raise. So he goes, so this looks like a tax, primarily because it's paid when you pay your taxes. It's collected by the IRS. It's in the IRS code, and it's determined by things that would be determined in taxation, size of family, amount of income, so on and so forth. So he says, it looks like a tax. Now, keep in mind, the Affordable Care Act calls it a penalty. But they say, oh, nope, we don't care what it's called. It looks like a tax, so we're gonna rule on it as a taxing. We'll get into that in a minute. Now, the interesting thing is on this, they said this was not a tax for the anti-injunction law. They said, nope, you don't. The anti-injunction law doesn't apply because this isn't a tax. Remember, the anti-injunction law says if there is a tax, you have to pay it before challenging it. They said, nope, you don't have to pay this before challenging it. You can challenge it and then pay it later. So they said it's not a tax for the anti-injunction law, but for the constitutional purpose of whether they can do it, it looks like a tax and it'll be ruled on as a tax. Here's the next paragraph. It is, of course, true that the act describes the payment as a penalty, not a tax. But while that label is fatal to the application of the Anti-Injunction Act, this is what I just said, it does not determine whether the payment may be viewed as an exercise of Congress's taxing power. It is up to Congress whether to apply the anti-injunction law, so it makes sense to guide Congress's label of choice. The choice does not, however, control whether an exaction is within Congress's constitutional power to tax. So right there they say it doesn't matter in the law what Congress calls it. It matters what we think it is. And we think this is a tax for constitutional purposes. That is the most ridiculous thing in the world. This is where we need a okay. I was telling you about what we're going to do. This is where we need a constitutional amendment. I'm going to talk more about that at the end. But we need a constitutional amendment to limit Congress's power to tax. Because right here, Chief Justice Roberts says, hey, this is within Congress's power to tax. And he goes on to talk more about Congress's power later on. But this is the very definition of legislating from the judicial bench. And he even says, we're not doing that. A little later on, we'll get into that. So Robert's major point is the legal difference is between a penalty and a tax. Now, this gets into splitting hairs. Is it a penalty? Is it a tax? And I hate splitting hairs. I hate legal hair splitting. But this is what they did. They split hairs legally and said, well, penalties and taxes are different. And they continue to do this until they exhaust us, the average citizen, make us run around in circles, chase our tail, until we don't know what's going on and we just go along with what they say. Because they're like, well, it's not a penalty, it's not a tax, but it is a tax, but it's not a penalty. What? These guys ran around themselves. So a little bit later on, they talk about why it's not a penalty. They cite an old Supreme Court ruling about child labor laws, saying that was a penalty, not a tax, even though the law said this is a tax, not a penalty. But with this one, with the Affordable Care Act, it's a tax, not a penalty, even though the Affordable Care Act said it was a penalty, not a tax. So here's the next applicable paragraph. A quick word from the sponsors of this show. Ryan's Sheds has thousands of beautiful shed designs. Whether it's a garden shed for your tools or a playhouse for your kids, or maybe your own small business building sheds, Ryan's has all your design and blueprint needs. We love gardening, being outside in the cool morning summer air, and especially enjoying the juicy, delicious produce we grow. The My Survival Farm Permaculture Gardening course will get you started. In good times, it will be a wonderful benefit in your life, and in desperate times, it will sustain you and your family. We bought a Harvest Right freeze dryer. If you want to preserve your own food with 97% of the nutrients still in it, freeze drying may be the way to go. Harvest Right does residential freeze drying better than anyone else. Finally, during this time, many of us have decided to go online as an outlet. But with all the additional online sites, blogs, and channels clamoring for our attention, how can you get Google and other search engines to reasonably recommend your page? Check out Keywords Researchers. My hero, Pat Flynn from Smart Passive Income says, quote, one of the best tools to find popular long-tail keywords for your niche. So go to our website, www.dustyfriday.com. That's www.dustyfriday.com, and check out our affiliates. Now back to our program. So here's the next paragraph that comes to the point. We have similarly held that exactions not labeled taxes nonetheless were authorized by Congress's power to tax. And then it cites a case. For example, we held that federal licenses to sell liquor and lottery tickets, for which the license had to pay a fee, would be sustained as exercising of the taxing power. So Congress does have the power to tax. That is correct. And the Supreme Court just says, well, if we think this falls within the power to tax, we don't care what Congress calls it in their bill. We're going to uphold it as a tax. Big mistake. I think that was a mistake. And even if they do, that is the very definition of legislating from the bench. When you determine that something Congress wrote is wrong, and so you uphold it in a different way, that is legislating from the bench. This is the nail in the coffin of freedom. Is this right here where the Supreme Court can say, we know they called it one thing, but we're going to call it another thing to make it constitutional. Here's the next applicable paragraph. The same analysis here suggests that the shared responsibility payment, that's the key phrase, may for constitutional purposes be considered a tax, not a penalty. First, for most Americans, the amount will be far less than the price of insurance, and by statute, it can never be more. It may often be a reasonable financial decision to make the payment rather than purchase insurance, unlike the prohibitory financial punishment in the child labor law. Second, the individual mandate contains no scienter requirement. That's talking about scienter is criminal behavior. You have to know you're doing something wrong, do it wrong, and then get a fine. It says you're not doing anything wrong. You're just paying an extra tax if you don't do this. Third, so it says that's the number one. That's the number two thing is there's no criminal behavior in doing this. It's just a tax. Third, payment is collected solely by the IRS through normal means of taxation, except the service is not allowed to use those means to suggest punitive sanction. So the reason that in the child labor laws we held that it was called a tax was there was a penalty to support that conclusion. So here's what it says. The reason the court in Drexel Furniture held that what was called a tax there was a penalty supports the conclusion that what is called a penalty here may be viewed as a tax. So in the child labor laws, the government said, this is a tax, not a penalty. The Supreme Court said, no, that's a penalty, not a tax. But in the Affordable Care Act, they say not buying insurance, there's a penalty, not a tax. And the Supreme Court said, no, it's a tax, not a penalty. And it falls within their taxing power. This is madness from the bench for them to do this. As long as the government does things, as long as the government does these things, not make the penalty more than the purchase price-ish, not be applied to criminal behavior, and third, run it through the IRS, it's considered a tax and Congress has the power to tax. That is the line right there. That's where they would get the power to tax us for not being vaccinated from COVID-19. They could say, well, COVID-19 vaccination may cost, I don't know, come up with some number, $300 or $400 or $500. If you did it privately. Okay, we'll set a tax at $400. So it's cheaper than getting vaccinated. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, there's no criminal behavior. You're not a criminal if you don't get vaccinated. You just have to pay a tax. Okay, that's number two. Number three, let's run it through the IRS. Did you get vaccinated? No. Okay, you've got a new tax. As long as they do those three things, keep the penalty under the cost of actually getting vaccinated, not attach any criminal behavior to it and run it through the IRS. According to the Obamacare legislation, the Obamacare Supreme Court ruling, it would be considered a tax completely within Congress's ability and power to tax. That was John Roberts' point.
What have you been doing, Robert?
Here's the next one. So this is what John Roberts says after this. People go, but you're having the government make us do something. Here's what he says. None of this is to say that the payment is not intended to affect individual conduct. Yeah, taxes are to affect individual conduct. Although the payment will raise considerable revenue, it is plainly designed to expand health insurance coverage. But taxes that seek to influence conduct are nothing new. Some of our earliest federal taxes sought to deter the purchase of imported manufactured goods in order to foster the growth of the domestic industry. The taxing power is very often applied for other purposes. Today, federal and state taxes can impose more than half the retail price of cigarettes, not just to raise more money, but to encourage people to quit smoking. And we have upheld such obviously related measures as taxes on selling marijuana and sawed-off shotguns. Indeed, every tax in some measure is in some measure regulatory. To some extent, it interposes an economic impediment to the activity taxed as compared with other non-taxed activities. That statute, that individual mandate, seeks to shape decisions about whether to buy health insurance and does not mean that it cannot be a valid exercise of the taxing power. That's what they say. Taxes are used to influence behavior. We need an amendment to fix that. We cannot be using taxation to affect our behavior. Yes, there are taxes on cigarettes that are designed to get you to quit smoking. I don't have to buy the cigarettes if I don't want to pay that tax. But now you're telling me that if I don't do something, I can be taxed because you're trying to motivate me to do something. Completely backwards. Completely wrong. So moving on, here's the next line. The joint dissenters argue that we cannot uphold the individual mandate as a tax because Congress did not frame it as such. In effect, they contend that even if the Constitution permits Congress to do exactly what we permitted the statute to do, the law must be struck down because Congress used the wrong labels. Chief Justice John Roberts goes on to say, we don't care about labels. We don't care about labels. We are going to uphold the law even though they used all the wrong labeling. And he uses a little story. He says, the required payment is not called a tax or a penalty or anything else. No one would, so here's the little story. He says, suppose Congress enacted a statute providing that every taxpayer who owns a house without energy efficient windows must pay $50 to the IRS. The amount due is adjusted based on factors such as taxable income, joint filing status, and is paid along with taxpayers' incomes. Those whose incomes is below the filing status need not pay. The required payment is not called a tax or a penalty or anything else. No one would doubt that this law imposed a tax and is within Congress's power to tax. That conclusion should not simply change Congress because Congress used the word penalty to describe the payment. Interpreting such a law, this is what he says, interpreting such a law would hardly, quote, impose a tax through judicial legislation. It would give practical effect to the legislature's enactment. Yes, it would impose judicial legislation, Roberts. That's exactly what it would do. If you start changing labels and doing Congress's work for them and making a law sustaining a unconstitutional law because the labels are wrong, that's exactly what you're doing, even though you just said that's not what we're doing. By the way, Congress probably is considering a law where you have to pay a tax if you don't have energy efficient windows. The next few paragraphs go on to say that this is not a direct tax, but an income tax. Remember, Congress can tax two ways. It can direct tax, which is like everybody in the country has to pay $20 for being alive. That's a direct tax called a capitation or a poll tax. We don't have a lot of those. The Supreme Court has ruled in many instances what is a direct tax. They don't limit income tax. They limit what is a direct tax. And everything that isn't a direct tax defined by the Supreme Court is an income tax. And remember, or is an indirect tax. Income tax is one of those indirect taxes. Those do not need to be equally apportioned to the states. Those only need to be sent out equally. So everyone pays or everyone doesn't pay based on different things. But basically they go on to say this is not a direct tax. This is an indirect tax through income taxation. Again, this is splitting hairs and so frustrating. They run circles around us. And then when we're dizzy, they go, well, just comply. Oh, I don't know what else to do. Now, Chief Justice John Roberts did make one point that is worth noting, but that he totally did not listen to himself. He said, there may, however, be a more fundamental objection to a tax on those who lack health insurance. Even if only a tax, the payment under the individual mandate, remains a burden that the federal government imposes for an omission, not an act. If it is troubling to interpret the Commerce Clause as authorizing Congress to regulate those who abstain from commerce, perhaps it should be similarly troubling to permit Congress to impose a tax for not doing something. Yes, Roberts, that should be troubling. That's a problem when you can impose a tax for not doing something. That is a huge problem. This is where we need another constitutional amendment limiting Congress's ability to tax. They have gone nuts with their ability to tax. So here's where it really gets tough. Here's where the Supreme Court says Congress basically has no limit to its power to tax, except that it says they have limits, it just won't define them. So it's like, you can go out into that field and you need to stay in some area, but I'm not going to tell you where. And it's like, this is amazing. Listen to this. We have already explained that the shared responsibility payment's practical characteristics pass muster as a tax under our narrowest interpretations of the taxing power. So there he's going, we've told you that this really is a tax, and we've been pretty tight on it. Because the tax at hand is within even those strict limits, we need not here decide the precise point at which an exaction becomes so punitive that the taxing power does not authorize it. There it is, right there. We don't need to get into how far you can go. We're just going to say you can't go forever, but we're not going to tell you how far. Here's his next line. It remains true, however, that the, quote, power to tax is not the power to destroy while this court sits. Really? Really? You just let that slip. You did not limit Congress's power to tax. You had a chance and you didn't do it, Mr. Chief Justice. That to me is the massive problem right there. They say, Congress has the power to tax, but we're not going to tell you where that power, how limited that power is. We're just going to say, it is limited. Keep that in mind. Well, where's the limit? They don't go into it. By contrast, Congress's authority under the taxing power is limited to requiring an individual to pay money into the federal treasury, no more. This is talking about the punitive side. If a tax is properly paid, the government has no power to compel or punish individuals subject to it. We do not make light of the severe burden that taxation, especially taxation motivated by regulatory purposes, can impose. But imposition of a tax, nonetheless, leaves an individual with a lawful choice to do or not to do certain acts so long as he is willing to pay the tax. So they go, yeah, look, we understand this may ruin your life, but, that's not our problem. The Affordable Care Act's requirement that certain individuals pay a financial penalty for not obtaining health insurance may reasonably be characterized as a tax because the Constitution permits such a tax. Here it is. Ready for this? This is what they just said. Because the Constitution permits such a tax, it is not our role to forbid it or pass upon its wisdom or fairness. So there it is, folks. That is it right there. Yeah, I'm talking to you. You need to look yourself in the mirror and go, are you ready to pay a tax, or are you ready to impose a tax on your neighbors for not being vaccinated? Because I'm telling you right now, Congress is considering this. The Democrats are thinking about this one. There's already vaccine passports in Israel that will begin to spill over into the West. And as that comes along, they'll then go, how do we incentivize to do this? They'll go, I got it. If you don't pay a tax, or if you don't get vaccinated, you pay a tax. And according to the Obamacare ruling, the 2012 Affordable Care Act ruling, signed by none other than our Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts, anything that isn't too burdensome run through the IRS, and doesn't have any criminal penalties attached with it, that passes muster as a tax, and Congress can tax all they want. That's what he said. So how do we fix this? We need to come up with a constitutional amendment that can limit Congress's power to tax, can limit the Commerce Clause, and can limit the Necessary and Wellness Clause. We have got to put those limits back on Congress. They are not going to do it themselves. Luckily for us, the Founding Fathers actually gave us a method to do that. They gave us Article 5 in the Constitution, which says Congress can pass amendments to the Constitution, and the states can also pass amendments to the Constitution. There is a movement out there right now called the Convention of States Movement. It is attempting to put together a convention of states to propose amendments to the Constitution with 3 proposals. Number 1, a balanced budget. Number 2, term limits. And number 3, reining in the federal government. This amendment needs to come under the reining in the federal government idea. I encourage everyone to go to the conventionofstates.com and take a look at what they're doing. Go to it for your state and sign up there, sign the petition. Let's get this done. We have got to rein in Congress's power, because the Chief Justice, once the Supreme Court rules on something, if we don't like it, the only way to change it is an amendment to the Constitution. When the Supreme Court makes a mistake, which they did in Obamacare, the only way to fix that is an amendment to the Constitution, because the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution. So what we have to do is get an amendment passed that limits Congress's power to do indirect taxing. That's what we got to do. We got to limit the other ones too. But specifically on this, and with a potential tax on unvaccinated persons, we need to limit Congress's ability to tax like that. Join me at the conventionofstates.com. Go to my website, www.dustyfriday.com. That's www.dustyfriday.com. You can look up there. You can find the Convention of States, and you can help sponsor my program. And we look forward to seeing you on the next one. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching The Edge. This has been Dusty Friday at the mic.